that you could end hunger in Britain. This is, I think, extremely enticing. It's one of the reasons why the free trade movement in Britain is so successful within the working classes.
Yeah.
And so this is why Karl Marx ends up giving a speech just about a year after the overturning of the Corn Laws, in which he says the socialists of the world should be free traders. Because this is the next small p progressive step in capitalist development. The American people themselves seem to be turning against this long-standing subscription to protectionism, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the Great Depression, the working class, the American labor. Everybody finally seems to realize we can't keep this protectionist status quo going.
Hello, I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Marc-William Palen. Marc is a historian at the University of Exeter. His work has appeared in Le Monde, Time magazine, The Washington Post, The Australian, and The New York Times. And he is also the author of the 2016 book, The Conspiracy of Free Trade, The Anglo-American Struggle Over Empire and Economic Globalization, 1846 to 1896, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Today, we will be discussing his new book, Pax Economica, Left-Wing Visions of a Free Trade World, which was published in April in the UK. It's a really fascinating study of the often under-discussed history of left-wing free traders from the 1840s to the present. It's a true work of global history in which basically no part of the world is left out. There isn't much on Bhutan, but other than that, pretty much everything is covered. And it's with good reason that it's been named one of the New Yorker's best books of the year. So, Marc, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
So, I thought I'd start by asking, basically, why did you decide to write this book now?
This began right as I was finishing up the first book, and one of the things I was finding when I was kind of looking forward in time in the archives in the early 20th century, I started finding all these peace organizations that were dedicated to creating a more interdependent world. And I was looking at the lists of officers on these organizations that were being founded during the First World War in Boston, New York, and it was a regular who's who of women's suffragists, abolitionists, socialist internationalists, Christian pacifists, people who would associate themselves with the left of center in politics, to put it mildly. And they were all working together to free world trade during and after the First World War. And so one of the things I was struck by, and I had a feeling once I started pulling the strings in both directions, it might tell an interesting story here, but it also seemed to go very much against the common trajectory of history interest in this right now, which is to look at the right-wing origins of free trade and free markets that often starts kind of the interwar years, the Hayeks, the Milton Friedmans, and the Mont-Pelerin Society, right, and Thatcher and Reagan, and then suddenly the neoliberal order, as some people call it, after the Cold War ends, and so much of that though was telling this right-wing narrative, and in many ways was at odds or contradicted this left-wing story that I was uncovering here by exploring how free trade was so influential in the peace and anti-imperialist movements from the mid-19th century. And so I thought it would be really useful to tell that story and see how they connect or contradict one another. And from, as far as I'm concerned, it was a much more nuanced and complex story that unfolds by pulling out the kind of left-wing origins.
I suppose part of the question that is naturally sort of evoked by this title and by this topic is, how exactly are you defining left-wing here? Because you include quite a range of different examples of the left in your book. Everything from, you class Richard Cobden, the mid-19th century liberal, through to Karl Marx, through to Cordell Hull in the 1930s. All of these are sort of part of your left umbrella. I wondered if you sort of struggled with that question of, okay, where is the edge of the left?
I mean, it gets a lot muddier, obviously, the closer you get to the center. But, I mean, I went pretty boilerplate with the definition here, just kind of the OED style definition, which is anybody who politically falls left of center. And this is still very big swath that it incorporates, but it incorporates the liberal radicals, the Richard Cobdens, the abolitionists, the peace workers who associated themselves as capitalists, but who nevertheless fell what we now call, and even then called the left of the political spectrum around issues of women's suffrage and so forth. And then, of course, the farther left we go, you end up with Karl Marx and the socialist internationalists of the story who are at the far end of the left wing, if you will.
Right. I think we may come back to that question, but before we do, I do want to bring up your first chapter, which is titled The Imperialism of Economic Nationalism. And one of the things I found interesting about the book is that you don't actually start with, for a book about left-wing visions of free trade, you don't actually start with the left-wingers or the free traders. You start out with the economic nationalist forces that are becoming more influential in the late 19th century. And one of the characters you kind of really focus on is Friedrich List. I wonder if you could sort of talk about why is Friedrich List such a kind of antagonist for your book?
No, great question. And I actually struggled a long time with the structure.
Oh, sure. Also, who is Friedrich List, in case anyone is...
I struggled for a long time with the structure, but to me, I had to start with painting the economic order the way that the left-wing internationalists of the story saw the world. And also, actually, in many ways, how the imperialists, the Friedrich Lists of the world saw it. And that is that from the around 1870 till the Second World War, at the very least, as an era of increasing economic nationalism. This kind of goes in the face or challenges. One of the ways I encounter all the time in IR scholarship and history as kind of the decades leading up to the First World War is this, what somebody recently called the golden era of globalization that somehow culminates in the First World War and then a turn inwards, right, in the interwar years. But this is not how these left-wing internationalists saw it. This is not how the leading advocates of the imperial order of the late 19th, early 20th century saw it. They understood it to be what it was, which is an era of high tariffs, economic nationalism, subsidies for big business. This was how the majority of governments were, this was the kind of policy that they were seeking out. And of course, this was also closely tied to the search for new markets, the scramble for Africa and so forth, this colonialism of the late 19th century. And it's this culmination of economic nationalism and imperial expansion that these critics of this economic nationalist order are trying to correct. And without understanding that, though, understanding the left-wing association with free trade and its connections with peace and anti-imperialism wouldn't make much sense, would it?
So what were the sort of intellectual underpinnings of this economic nationalism?
And this is where Friedrich List comes in, right? So this Friedrich List was a German politician and theorist who ended up moving to the United States in the 1820s. And he kind of ended up settling in what was then sort of the intellectual hotbed of protectionist activism in the United States, Pennsylvania at that time. And he spends quite a bit of time there. He gets involved in kind of protectionist politics in the United States. He's inspired by Alexander Hamilton, as well as other American protectionists. And then he becomes an American citizen. And so part of the story, at least the beginnings of the story, is about kind of the American making of Friedrich List and this kind of German-American system of protectionism that he helped cultivate before he comes back to Germany and publishes his magnum opus, The National System of Political Economy, in 1841, which in many ways he sees as sort of a counter to the growing popularity of free trade in Britain itself, and Richard Cobden and the Anti-Corn Law League and this middle-class pressure group that's trying to turn Britain away from its mercantilist protectionist policies and trying to do something new with the creation of a free trade system in Britain, which they then think will be something that the rest of the world will follow suit. Friedrich List is not a fan of this development, and in part, this is what he's responding to. And of course, he also explicitly in that book not only advocates for infinite industrial protectionism for developing states like Germany, like the United States, he also makes a very strong case for why those places also should be colonial empires in their own.
Yeah, it's an interesting combination of sort of infant industry protections combined with colonialism in order to secure the resources and potentially the markets for that sort of thing. On the topic of Richard Cobden and this sort of British movement for free trade, one of the interesting things is that while, as you rightly point out, most of the world, including the United States from the 1870s on, is moving towards more protectionism, Britain really doesn't go in that direction until the 1930s. And why is that? Why is the free trade movement so much more politically powerful in Britain than in other imperialist nations?
I mean, it's a question that's perplexed historians for quite some time, hasn't it? And why is Britain the kind of free trade exception to this protectionist rule? I think part of it was the timing of things. Of course, Britain was more industrially advanced than its competitors at this point, but in the mid-19th century. It was also then experiencing a lot more urbanization into these industrial centers, and with that came a lot of poverty of all these people kind of stuck in these new urban centers. And so part of the draw here, one of the reasons why I think it became so popular in Britain is, as an island nation, dependent in many ways on imports as well as exports, is this promise of cheap food for the working classes, that you could end hunger in Britain. This is, I think, extremely enticing. It's one of the reasons why the free trade movement in Britain is so successful within the working classes. There's something that will continue for decades and decades, and to the consternation of the protectionists in Britain as well. And then, of course, Richard Cobden does something fascinating here, too, and his disciples. It's not just about cheap food, as far as they see it. They also then associate free trade with the sort of new version of an internationalist system, a new vision, a new peaceful anti-imperial vision for the world, that if not just Britain, but the entire world embraced free trade and became more interdependent. This is what capitalist peace theory, interdependence. In many ways, this is sort of the kind of when it's really starting to take root in the midst of what is now sort of a global economic system, thanks to railways and steamship lines and transatlantic cable and so forth. And so he realizes that if you can get rid of the protective tariffs on foreign grain, then you could undermine the influence of the aristocratic landed elites. The aristocratic landed elites are militant. Yeah. They're the main kind of drivers of this militant foreign policy, the kind of nationalistic defense of British imperialism. And so if you can undermine their economic power by undermining the protective tariffs on foreign grain, which they're gaining from, then you can start to democratize British foreign policy. And so that's the kind of peace side of things.
Yeah, I found that really interesting, and how that idea seems to sort of spread over to Germany to a large extent. And you even see this among German social democrats in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, thinking of free trade explicitly in terms of undermining the power of the Junkers. Yeah. And that's a really interesting topic, I think, in general. We've started to, with the social democrats, we've started to touch on Marx and Marxism. What were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' sort of attitudes to free trade? Because they're operating at the same time as Cobden and in the same country.
I mean, this is one of the many things about this story that surprised me when I was doing the research for it. And I think I sort of came at this with a kind of a Cold War era gaze, too, which saw the Cold War and maybe even modern history as in part a conflict between capitalism and socialism. And so I was really surprised to increasingly find, not just in the late 19th, early 20th century, Germany or Argentina, where socialist internationalists were avowed free traders. But even going back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels themselves, where this story begins. And it is a story of evolution, right? The socialist internationalists also, their views on free trade continue to change as the world order changes around them. So Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, of course, are living in Britain in the 1840s. So they're here at the height of this free trade activism of the Anti-Corn Law League, of Richard Cobden, John Bright, and his disciples here. And they're paying attention. So there's a sort of kind of almost a hegemonic influence, I think, of this kind of middle-class free trade movement on the way that Engels and Marx are thinking about the evolution, the development of the capitalist system.
Yeah.
And so this is why Karl Marx ends up giving a speech just about a year after the overturning of the Corn Laws, in which he says the socialists of the world should be free traders, because this is the next small p progressive step in capitalist development, and therefore socialists of the world should support it because it's getting us closer to socialist revolution, and it's also uniting the workers of the world through an interdependent marketplace, right? So that's how Karl Marx. It's not nearly as glowing as and kind of idyllic as the kind of the Richard Cobdens of the era. He's very skeptical that it's going to bring world peace, for example. But he's also quite critical of protectionism in lines that are very much in line with what Richard Cobden would have thought, which is protectionism is sort of in very violent terms. He describes how protectionism works against the nation that practices it, as well as against its trading partners. And so in that sense, even you can start to see the kind of socialist critique of protectionism making its way felt. And then if you want to jump forward then to the Social Democratic Party and the socialists in
Karl Kautsky and that sort of thing.
Kautsky and Bernstein and of course the Labour Party and its early years in Britain, and Bertrand Russell and the Argentine Socialist Party. You can actually start to see this evolution of socialist internationalist thought. One of the things I was really surprised at is that kind of half-hearted endorsement of free trade by Karl Marx in the 1840s largely disappears by the time we get to the First World War among socialist internationalists. By the time we get there, they're sounding much more like Cobdenites, like Manchester liberals, and of course they're working alongside capitalists. And so that they're much more connection. There's much more of a connection than with free trade and world peace by the early 20th century than there was in the mid-19th.
Yeah. Well, one of the most interesting facts I got from the book is that one of Karl Kautsky is one of the leading intellectuals in the German Social Democratic Party. At the start of the First World War, he lists sort of three conditions for an acceptable socialist peace. And the first condition is, freedom for subjugated nations. The second condition is disarmament. But the third condition is free trade between nations. And you seem to say that that's like quite a strong trend through the German Social Democratic Party.
To the point that, it's so strong by around 1900. Again, they're partly the party of opposition, so they're opposed to the protectionist imperial politics of the German government and the German historical school, which dominates German universities and has quite a bit of influence on German politics. They're kind of the next generation of Listians in Germany and have quite a bit of power. So they're pushing back against those intellectuals, the right-wing nationalist intellectuals in Germany, and they're pushing back against the German imperial government. And so that's in part where the SPD is maneuvering within as that party of opposition. But one of the things that was surprising, Karl Kautsky and Edvard Bernstein actually spent quite a bit of time in Britain in the late 19th century, where they were hobnobbing with Marxists as well as with liberal radicals like J.A. Hobson, and to the point where they've, even their biographers conclude that they're in many ways more Cobdenite than they are Marxist when it comes to the issue of free trade and peace in that sense. And a lot of socialists, like the Labour Party and the Women's Cooperative Movement in Britain at this point, they're looking to the SPD for inspiration by around 1900, which is really fascinating. So they're paying attention to one another, and in many ways, the SPD starts to kind of take the lead from this left-wing scene.
Yeah. Although, this is certainly true, but at the same time, Marx does seem to sort of lay some of the seeds for anti-Marxist protectionism that comes later, in that he does seem to, he's got his very equivocal support of free trade, but he also does explicitly seem to say that free trade is going to drive down the wages of workers. And it's good insofar as it is an accelerationist move, in that it spreads capitalism through the world and will hasten the socialist revolution, which seems quite different to these sort of later social democratic politicians in Germany who seem to sort of treat free trade as good on its own terms. I wonder if there's also an issue that by the 20th century, once these socialist politicians are no longer in opposition, And once they start getting into power, there seems to be a sort of natural contradiction between the idea that you should use state power to influence the market and direct industry internally, but then to say that, oh, when it comes to international trade, we should just leave it. We should just leave it alone. We should take a laissez-faire approach. Is that a problem for many of these socialists in Europe? And if so, how do they kind of deal with that?
It doesn't seem to be. The contradiction doesn't seem to be there, because their understanding of how to maintain free trade increasingly involves not just being okay with domestic regulations of, say, child labor laws or how many hours people work in a week, or getting rid of subsidies for big businesses and this kind of thing. But it was also about this is something that really starts to foment by around the First World War, which is the growing need by this new generation of left-wing free traders that something has to change, right? We've been trying it through this grassroots method to overturn this protectionist imperial system, and we ended up with the First World War. We need something with more teeth. And this is why they're going to get on board the League of Nations idea. So you have this kind of Wilsonian, liberal, capitalist kind of program of supranational regulation that's born that has a lot of support from these socialist internationalists that I look at in the book. And it's in part because they see the League of Nations as something that's going to be essential for regulating the distribution of raw materials. So this is, I think, one key area where regulating international trade becomes very paramount, because one of the things they point out is that it's the protectionist turn by around 1870 that leads to this domestic inefficiencies at home, that leads to all these imperial powers to search out new markets for exporting surplus capital abroad, but also to exploit them for raw materials, right? So, and then bring those raw materials back to the industrializing core. And so it's this symbiosis between exporting surplus capital and bringing back raw materials that all these critics of the imperial system say is responsible for creating the geopolitical conflict and imperial, fights between these groups across the globe. And so if you can get rid of this conflict, this fight for raw materials that in part drove colonial expansion, then you can get rid of one of the main economic drivers of geopolitical conflict. And so for them, they saw no contradiction, because if you regulate, if left to their own devices, nations will continue to make the same economic nationalist mistakes and imperial conquest that they continue to do. So increasingly, again, no contradiction at all with calling for free trade as a way towards world peace and devolution of empires, but also seeing that as fine as something that we need to regulate as well.
Yeah. So you have this kind of almost utopian optimism in the aftermath of the First World War that, the League of Nations is going to have real teeth and it's going to be able to, create truly free trade rather than this sort of imperialist protectionist system that's developed by the start of the First World War. How do left-wing free traders then respond to the sort of even greater turn towards protectionism in the aftermath of the Great Depression? And what's their sort of approach to that once, from 1932, even Britain has basically abandoned free trade? Do many of them shift onto other issues, or do they carry on kind of plugging away at this?
I mean, for most of that period, it's just one of just dismay. And in a weird sort of I told you so sense, right? We thought the League of Nations might be the way to keep nations from repeating the same mistakes that they made leading up to the First World War. Instead, as far as they're concerned, all the wrong lessons were learned. And so these nationalist governments that ended up controlling the League of Nations policies were not too keen on freeing their own trade, let alone freeing world trade. And so as much as they tried to, through grassroots efforts to influence the League of Nations, it increasingly became more of the remit of these protectionist imperial powers that survived the First World War, the mandate system and so forth. And then when the Great Depression strikes in 1929, and then you have the Hawley-Smoot tariff in the United States in 1930, which is infamous. You see them just absolutely dismayed at that these countries continue to look towards self-sufficiency and autarky in the face of all this, and shrinking world trade instead of expanding it. So the Socialist Party of America under Norman Thomas, who's the longstanding leader of the Socialist Party of America, he lambasts the Hawley-Smoot tariff for creating this geopolitical conflict, for worsening the Great Depression. Of course, when Britain itself finally succumbs to this kind of siren song of protectionism in 1932 and joins the imperial preference system already at play there. This is the world order lost its last kind of powerful free trade leader, and as a result of that, according to this left-wing internationalist critique, what happens across the 1930s and ultimately Second World War does not surprise them, really that much, does it?
Although, it's interesting that it's almost exactly at this moment of the sort of nadir of the free trade movement that America's position actually starts to shift from having spent the whole of the 19th century as being a highly protectionist country with very high tariffs. From 1933. Cordell Hull arrives in as Secretary of State, and there starts to be a transition. Could you sort of talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm surprised at how in many ways also marginalized Cordell Hull has become in this larger story about the liberalizing of the 20th century global economy, despite being the longest serving U.S. Secretary of State at the very moment, as you point out, when the United States is after 70 years of Republican-style protectionist rule is turning towards liberalizing American trade and increasingly calling for the world to liberalize trade, in many ways mirroring what was going on in Britain in the 1840s. And this is in part why Cordell Hull, one of his nicknames that he gets is the Tennessee Cobden. And I remember a long time ago when I came across that nickname, I don't think you can understand why he gets that nickname without understanding this 100-year-long left-wing internationalist fight for freeing world trade as a method for creating a more peaceful world. This is exactly what Cordell Hull believes in. And in fact, you can kind of trace him along here too. This is why, again, we have to look back to the late 19th century to understand what the creation of the world order in the mid-20th. Cordell Hull came of age in the late 19th century. He got his political start as a stump speaker for Grover Cleveland in the Great Debate of 1888, which was this kind of showdown between these American Cobdenites and the Democratic Cleveland administration seeking re-election versus the Republican protectionists who were trying to keep the United States on its protectionist path. The Republicans end up winning that particular debate, but that's where he gets his start. And then Cordell Hull becomes even more radicalized to this kind of liberal radical critique of protectionism because of the way he understands the causes, the economic causes of the First World War. And then finally, the American people themselves seem to be turning against this long-standing subscription to protectionism, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the Great Depression, the working class, the American labor. Everybody finally seems to realize we can't keep this protectionist status quo going. And as a result of that, when FDR gets elected and appoints Cordell Hull as Secretary of State, the left-wing free traders are like, finally, we have somebody in power who understands things the way they understands the world the way we understand it. And one of the things I try to show at the end of each of these chapters, too, whether it's the liberal radical chapter or the socialist chapter or the feminist free trade chapter or the Christian pacifist chapter, is how by the 1930s, all these movements start supporting Cordell Hull. It's a really fascinating kind of moment in which they're all working together to support Cordell Hull's liberalizing of U.S. and world trade through the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, and then through his laying the groundwork for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is created in 1947, which becomes the WTO in the 1990s, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's that left-wing story, origin story in many ways of post-1945 economic liberalism.
Yeah, so if, particularly in the US context, the sort of turn away from protectionism is largely driven by New Deal Democrats and left free traders of one sort or another, why is it that today and in the latter half of the 20th century, if someone starts talking extensively about how great free trade is, they're probably going to be on the political right on the whole. Why did that shift seem to happen?
That's a really big question, and it's one I try to piece out in the last chapter. I think I give it a shot, although I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to pull out the larger history of post-1945 kind of grassroots efforts to keep or even expand trade liberalization along these left-wing lines. So that's where you have like the fair trade movement that pops up around 1970 as well, that kind of in keeping with this movement. But I mean, I think part of it is that they seem to, the left-wing free traders and Cordell Hull, they think they finally have got their Pax Economica in the late 1940s. But it's amazing how quickly it disappears with the onset of the Cold War. And the kind of Manichaean ideological divide that the Cold War creates. I think it also is part of the reason why a lot of people who maybe were closer to the center within this kind of movement start moving further to the right. The Cold War, I think, plays a big part here in shifting some of these political alignments already in the 1950s and 1960s, definitely in the United States, but certainly elsewhere as well, and in Britain too. So some of these kind of leftist center folks who are moving more and more to the right in their opposition to the spread of communism. Of course, the communists themselves play a big part in the creation of this Manichaean divide as well. And then I think within the Christian movement in particular, you start to really see this shift, even the shift of rhetoric of instead of free trade, it becomes known as free enterprise. The association of free trade with peace and anti-imperialism seems to disappear. The support for things like the United Nations is put on the back burner at the very least. Within this kind of version of free trade that's evolving within the Cold War era, and so I think that's part of it. And then I think even people like Hayek and Milton Friedman are moving increasingly to the right politically, in part as a result of the Cold War. And I think this starts to put them at more and more loggerheads with the left-wing internationalists of this story, and also I presumably allows for them to align with a kind of a hawkish, militant conservative wing in places like Britain and the United States, where there's a new sort of relationship.
Although that had always been present, at least in a British context, this notion that support for free trade and support for military intervention abroad is always present. Like, Lord Palmerston, big advocate of free trade. Yeah. Big advocate of exporting it with gunboats. But that doesn't seem to have put off left-wing anti-imperialist free traders in the mid-19th century or the early 20th century.
No. I mean, in fact, and again, that's one of the things I'm pushing back against here too, is historians tend to focus on the rise of free trade imperialism in Britain, the Lord Palmerstons, the Opium Wars. One of the things I'm trying to draw attention to is who were the leading opponents of those very same things.
Also free trade.
It was Richard Cobden and his disciples who were both vehemently opposed to the coercive enforcement of free trade policies in the case of China, or the coercive enforcement of free trade in the quote-unquote less civilized colonies like India and Ireland. They said, this is not what we mean. It's supposed to be non-interventionism. People should just want to embrace these free trade policies and ideas because they can see how well it's working for us and how well it can work for them. Kind of leading by example, not through the barrel of a gun. And so that's the other story here, right? It's not the Palmerstons that I'm worried about here. It's those who oppose them from the left that are, I think, the important missing link to this larger story.
Yeah. Final question from me, and then we'll hand over to the audience for Q&A. With protectionism again seeming to sort of come back into vogue, particularly in Europe and America since 2016, are there any lessons that we can learn from successful left-wing free trade advocates from the 20th or 19th century?
I will try my hardest to end with some bit of optimism. Based on this history of left-wing free trade activism. I think what we've seen since 2016, the kind of the break from the single market in the case of Britain, the return of the kind of trade barriers arising where they didn't exist before this, rising food prices and so forth that we're seeing. Even the potential creation of a hard barrier between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, and the potential return of the Troubles. So there's even there you can see the kind of the capitalist peace theory coming into play with the connection between geopolitical conflict and this dislocation from European integration that was such a big part of the left-wing free trade movement's designs throughout most of this story. One of the kind of secondary stories here is how adamant they are that a united Europe, economically united Europe, is key to making sure that Europe no longer ends up going to war with itself.
Right.
And so I think that's the key here. So 2016 in Britain was a really fascinating moment. And then we had that the same year, we had the election of Donald Trump, an avowedly protectionist Republican president. One of the things I was trying to say, and I think comes through in this book here, is this was not some sort of anomaly, right? Trump was often portrayed as some sort of strange shift from the Reagan Revolution, which, I mean, I guess that's the point, right? Is it was unusual, in fact, from a larger historical stance that you have the Republican Party becoming the party of free trade and free markets, as we come to think of it. The longer history of the Republican Party, going back to its founding in the 1850s, is the story of Republicans being the party of protectionism, especially once the slavery comes to an end in 1865. And so I was making the case that what we have here, as far as historical lessons, is
back to normality.
It's a return to the status quo. And in many ways, perhaps too, we're seeing that with the Conservative Party here. The way that it's embracing kind of anti-immigration, even if that means abandoning trade liberalization with Europe. This is in many ways returning to the conservative protectionist status quo that was, which is his main. That was the party of protectionism and defense of empire. Joseph Chamberlain is prime example. Theresa May's political hero, Lodestar, which I was really surprised to come across back then. So I in many ways, I see what we have now as a return to a protectionist, economic nationalist order with full-blown acts of imperial aggression in some cases, that the left-wing free traders of this book would not find all that unusual. I guess maybe the optimism here, though, is that at least for a period, they were able to work together in a very concerted way. And they were able to work with people with similar ideas and various governments, and to some extent helped in the creation of something different. In the late 1940s, the Cold War, obviously something that nobody could foresee that I think in many ways kind of led to its very quick end. But that's not to say that coalition couldn't potentially be viable for those who sympathize with this more internationalist vision of world trade. And perhaps even, crossing the boundaries amongst, economic internationalists from the left and the right, realizing that maybe something is needed, either strengthening the United Nations, strengthening the Bretton Woods institutions, strengthening the World Trade Organization as ways for overcoming these nationalistic tendencies toward protectionism, or replacing it with something that has more teeth. Once again, although hopefully this time, if that's what happens, it won't take another world war for the creation of a new supranational structure to help maintain a freer trading system in the name of anti-imperialism. So I think that's maybe the lessons here for those who are not terribly enticed by this economic nationalist order we find ourselves in.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we can move over to audience Q&A. I think we have a roving microphone. So first, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. First one from Reem Ibrahim.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for what was a really fascinating and interesting discussion. My question was about supranational institutions and the role that you think they might play in the future. You spoke a little bit about the World Trade Organization and other supranational institutions that are supposed to promote freer trade, but I think that historically, at least in recent times, they seem to have also been promoting protectionism. And so I wonder what your thoughts were on why that might be the case and what that could look like in the future if they were to be promoting freer trade and anti-protectionism.
Well, I mean, I think it's just taking the view of what the left-wing free traders might say. And there's not, I have to say, it is a story in many ways of what, maybe this is the moment we find ourselves in where this could potentially have some interesting utility here too. It's not to say that this free trade internationalism has gone away. I said the fair trade movement is I think, an important part of this kind of altered globalization. Again, I think embracing the idea that you can have free trade, but also you can have environmental protections and you can have labor protections. They don't have to be kind of seen as at loggerheads. Like I think a lot of people tend to associate the WTO as much more about liberalizing markets, less concerned about the kind of social justice aspects that can come with trade, and that from the left-wing perspective needs to. As far as WTO becoming a promoter of protectionism, I mean, of course, the fact that the United States is in many ways the progenitor of the WTO through the creation of the GATT, and then also became the main actor working against the WTO from within under the Trump administration. I think to me that's the main explanation for this at least more recent turn away from what the WTO could represent. I think a lot of the blame goes to the Trump administration, and in many ways the Biden administration has just continued to, not to the same degree, but has continued many of the kind of protectionist policies, trade wars, and so forth that the Trump administration had so brazenly enacted.
Okay. Another question from Bruno Pryor. Sorry.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I'd be quite interested in going back to what Daniel hinted at, a definition of left wing. You sort of left it hanging there as the OED definition, but I don't think we've got very far on what actually that is. I was wondering, a classic part of the left wing would be the unions. I don't know if I missed, did you mention the unions? Did you cover the unions in your book? It's sort of intrinsically closed shop, I suppose. You would imagine philosophically they're not very free trade, but I have no idea if there's some sort of union left-wing free trade movement.
Oh yeah, great question. I mean, so in the context of Britain, the connection between trade unionism and free trade is a rich one. You also have the cooperative movement, which is, I think, another important part of this story. Obviously, another one that still exists today and has a different alter globalization vision of how world trade could operate. I imagine we've all shopped at a co-op. We might not realize that we're walking into the kind of the vestiges of what was once a very rich part of this left-wing free trade tradition that was very much pro-labor, pro-working class, and also with origins in the Manchester area, right? So right around this, again, all kind of roads in this story lead back to Manchester in the 1840s, and that's also where you have the Rochdale pioneers who have a different vision from their Manchester liberal counterparts, a non-profit vision of free trade, kind of a moderate socialist vision, because they think that one of the issues that the liberal radicals like Cobden aren't taking into account is the profit motive. So their version of the cooperative movement, through either profit sharing or discounts and things like this, and getting rid of the middlemen and the consumers becoming the producers. We're all consumers. So it's this working class element of the cooperative movement that begins in Britain in the 1840s and rivals the international labor union movement by the 1920s as it becomes more involved with the international peace movement. Alongside the women's peace movement, although there's a lot of people that overlap here, the international cooperative movement, I think, becomes, in many ways, one of the leaders of the international peace movement through its advocacy for nonprofit free trade as it sees it. So I think through the cooperative movement, and there are labor unions by the 1930s in the United States also that are much more supportive of this. So I think in certain contexts, you do have the labor unions, you do have the working classes getting on board. And it's not just a kind of a middle-class intellectual kind of story that's being told.
Kenya, thank you. Another question, the gentleman at the front.
I'd be interested, Mark, your take on India and what's happened there, because sort of the first 50 years after independence, we had a very left-wing government in Indira Gandhi, very protectionist licensing system. And since then, into this century, a much more right-wing party and opening up to much more free trade orientated. I'm interested in your take on what's going on there.
I mean, I have to say, I as a historian, I try to shy away from too much contemporary resonances, as tempting as it is. But I mean, my understanding too is that there's still quite a bit of economic nationalist kind of elements running through Indian politics at this point too. But the shift you mentioned might be correct. Well, I mean, one of the fascinating things, India is actually a really important part of the story too, because as much as it's telling that story of the first chapter, the imperialism of economic nationalism, there's a very important subsection of that at the very end that I have, which is the anti-imperialism of economic nationalism, the kind of anti-colonial exceptions to this economic nationalist rule. And where you find that, rather fittingly, are the areas of the world that are actually having free trade coercively forced upon it within the British Empire, pretty much only. So you have the British coercively enforcing free trade in India and Ireland, and this is where you find people turning to Frederick List in the name of anti-colonial nationalism. So the Swadeshi movement that begins around 1905, the Sinn Féin movement, the Sinn Féin party is founded the same year. In fact, Arthur Griffith, he launches the Sinn Féin party by saying, I'm a disciple of Frederick List, and Ireland needs to become disciples of Frederick. Indian anti-colonial nationalists within the Swadeshi movement see this. They translate the speech that Arthur Griffith has, and they point to Ireland's embrace of Frederick List and say that this is just a universalizing of the Swadeshis' kind of economic nationalist anti-colonialism in that sense. And so there's part of this is about the narrow readings of books. So the narrow reading of Frederick List as somebody who can thwart British free trade machinations for some places like this. At the same time, Frederick List is being used to justify economic nationalism and imperial expansion in other contexts. And so it is a left-wing economic national story in that sense, but it's because of sort of a narrow reading of Frederick List as it becomes a bigger part of the Swadeshi movement story and then kind of solidifies after independence in the late 40s.
Well, one of the things I found really interesting about that chapter is how often in nations that have been colonized, they react against the economic policy of the country that's doing the colonizing. So, you mentioned how at exactly the same time that Sinn Féin and Indian nationalists are arguing for protectionism in the free trading British Empire. In the Philippines, there's a big movement for free trade against the sort of Republican dominated protectionism, which is sort of locking them out of the US market, which I found really interesting.
Right, and one of the things I'm suggesting too, I think other historians need to do it in a bigger way for other empires too. But once you understand the economic nationalist makeup of the American empire, the way it implements economic nationalist policies against its own colonies, and it's legalized by a Supreme Court decision. Downes v. Bidwell in 1901, the beginnings of the Insular cases, which rules that the Constitution does not follow the flag, and therefore the United States can implement whatever tariffs it wants on its own colonies, including tariffs between the United States mainland and its colonies, especially if it means we can keep immigration from said colonies from flowing in, right? We have to have different rules. And so it's the protectionist policies that are placed on Puerto Rico, informally on Cuba, and then the Philippines, that you have anti-colonial activism in the name of free trade, right? The imperialism of free trade, or anti-imperialism of free trade in the context of this protectionist imperial projects. And that's why, again, the British examples of, say, India and Ireland are rather unusual exceptions to this rule.
Any questions? The gentleman at the front in the red.
I'm Winston Lee from SOAS Politics. So my question is, given that left-wing free trade often include element for protecting workers' rights. So recently, U.S. have economic trade of like 90-something% on Chinese EV, and EU have 30-something% on the Chinese EV as well. Does it fit into left-wing free trade value to protect the workers' right, even though it might be like slowing down the green transition in these two countries?
That's a good question. I mean, I suppose where I would say is I don't know if I have an answer for you because again, it's what remains of this left-wing free trade tradition is quite muted. But I think the fair traders and the international cooperativists would be the one to ask. The ones to ask how are they reconciling protections of workers and labor rights at the same time? How are they reconciling protecting labor rights and environmental protections, right? And how do they see that fitting within an alternative free trading system? I think that'd be a great question, but I think that it's not something I can honestly say off the top of my head.
Do we have any more questions? The gentleman in the blazer just up here.
Hello, Mark. I want to put to you that certainly left-wing people that I'm familiar with divide into two camps, and this is associated, or this is in line with some questions that you've already been asked, but I'll ask it all the same. On one side, you tend to get those socialists who are essentially protectionists, believe in socialism, if you like, in one country. And on the other hand, with a whole lot of grey in between, you get these so-called free traders. They're not really, I would call them managed traders, that believe in trade being a good thing as long as the conditions of production are levelized across the world in a way that's, quite honestly, quite imperialist, really, imposing one country's standards on another country. Now, that's very much a current narrative, I would say, amongst left-wing people, labour standards, but also, more importantly now, environmental standards, very much to the fore. Now, how far was this narrative part of the historical narrative on free trade circles, or was it just sort of dominated by the idea of we can get cheaper food for our working class supporters on one hand, and maybe free trade brings world peace on the other side to simplify things?
I mean, yeah. I mean, the kind of material aspect of promising, it's food security, right? Promising to make sure that nobody ever goes hungry is one of the things underlying this free trade vision that they have, especially from the left, and then it becomes even more important once the women's suffragists become big players in this. So, during the First World War, these women's suffrage internationalists become what somebody has referred to as the suffragist wing of the international peace movement during and after the First World War. And so you have the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom that's founded in 1919. Jane Addams, the social reformer from Chicago, who becomes the inaugural president of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, based in Geneva, still exists to this day. Hardcore free trade organization, again, pushing back against all this stuff. So you have, I'd say, this connection with democratization and more peaceful exchange is a very key part of the left-wing tradition, at least from this middle-class movement of the peace movement, the anti-imperialist movement. It's cheap food, it's food security, it's also undermining the influence of aristocratic landed elites, democratizing foreign policy, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why women's suffragists become so involved in it. But then you also have the socialists, the Marxist tradition, as I call it. And I found this, and it maps on in very fascinating ways too. So you have the socialist internationalists like Berenstein and Kautsky and Russell and Norman Thomas, who are associating themselves with the peace and anti-imperialist movement. When you look at the socialism in one country folks during this period, I mean, let alone so you have like George Bernard Shaw, who was, in his early years, he was a disciple. I was kind of surprised. He was a disciple of one of the leading left-wing liberal radicals of this era, a guy named Henry George. I don't know if there's any Georgists in the room. I was just on the Henry George radio show the other day. Like, it's in California. Like, it's still very much a thing. And Arden, Delaware, for example, it still exists. It's a George's colony that was created in 1900. It's one of its early founders, Lizzie McGee, decided she wanted to create a board game that could teach the young and old alike the principles of this left-wing free trade tradition, breaking up land monopolies. And of course, this is kind of the origin story. She creates what we now know as monopoly in 1905 in Arden, Delaware. So it's still a Georgist colony. George Bernard Shaw was a Georgist in Britain. There was a lot of Georgists at that time that really tapped in and really liked the kind of taxing land, taxing aristocrats to believe it or not. Like imagine in London if there was a
land value tax.
It's a land value tax that would actually encourage people to build houses, to make it so that it's more affordable to live here and maximize.
Well, you'd need to reform planning first.
Well, it's clear.
Yeah.
But George Bernard Shaw was a Henry Georgist in his early years, and then he gets drawn into socialism. But in the context of the Fabian Society, it's kind of under his direction that the Fabian Society becomes more and more nationalistic, more and more anti-free trade, and more pro-imperial, to the point that people like Bertrand Russell that feel that they can no longer be in the Fabian Society.
Because essentially, we want the British Empire, but make it a bit socialist.
Exactly.
And we don't like free trade. Yeah, that's an interesting line. I think we have time for one final question. So, the gentleman at the back did have it. You can ask it finally at the end in the after section.
Thank you. My question was actually with the peace dividend associated with free trade. I was curious with any of these sort of early left-wing groups if there was any empirical underpinning or any empirical basis on free trade and economic interdependence. And the extent to which it created a peace dividend, and if it did, if there were any prerequisites or conditions upon which it created strategic stability.
And can we just take one final question at the front, because I feel a bit guilty now. So we'll take them both together. So first question on the peace dividend, and then second brief question.
You touched on the Europe as embracing free trade within its borders. One of the reasons that I was so supportive of Brexit was that I felt that Europe was in fact a very protectionist setup outside its borders, and that we in the UK would have an opportunity, if we left, to embrace proper free trade with the rest of the growing world. Comment, please.
Okay.
So the peace dividend, I guess it depends on the time frame. I think historically speaking, a lot of people do point to the mid-19th century. So when Britain turned to free trade in 1846, and it did so unilaterally, the United States was actually followed suit by lowering its tariffs substantially with the Walker Tariff in 46. A lot of people saw this freer trade trend just between Britain and the United States alone as helping to avoid conflict, say, over the Oregon boundary disputes that were happening in a big way. And then, of course, the protectionist turn led to all sorts of near military conflicts between the United States and Canada in the 1870s and beyond. But from around 1846 to around 1870, I think a lot of people see this as a rare moment of kind of transatlantic, Euro-American trade liberalization that was, at least within the Euro-America, one that was surprisingly scanty on military conflict. And so I think in that sense, people, again, correlation, maybe if not causation, for understanding the mid-90s. And this is the kind of stuff, too, that Vladimir Lenin's looking back at and trying to make sense of, as well as J.A. Hobson from the kind of more center liberal radical part of the spectrum here. When they're looking back, if you read Lenin's Imperialism, Highest Stage of Capitalism, right? He's pointing to this he calls it the more peaceful free trade period of the mid-19th century that then naturally is replaced by this protectionist imperial expansionism and military conflict. And so it's a big. So I think the mid-19th century peace dividend is a big part of this story, and then we can discuss whether or not there was much of one that followed the Second World War. It really, if there was one, it doesn't last very long. Following the onset of the Cold War, just a few years later. And I'm sure some would point to the fact that after the Cold War ends, relatively speaking, I think some studies have been done to show that this seems to make the capitalist peace theory. It has some water to it in the 90s, early 2000s. But I'll leave that to the international relations theorists. But it's a really interesting question now. And as far as the EU, I mean, I think this is the age-old debate, isn't it? In many ways, depending on how you look at it, right? Is the EU, or was the EU, the world's largest internal free trading system, or was it the world's largest protectionist bloc? Right? In a way, they're both views are right, depending on how you want to look at it. Right? So I think that's part of the issue. So I understand how people might have thought that leaving the EU and the single market would allow for kind of a return in many ways to this mid-19th century unilateral free trade system. But I think a lot of people that were skeptical of that will first just the non-tariff barriers to trade that would result from that breaking away and increasing costs for food, amongst other things, for British working folks. And how long it's going to take, though, to develop those trade deals. I think a lot of people who deal with that in a much bigger way were much more skeptical about the speed in which people were promising some sort of new era of unilateral free trade. It seems like it turns out that those skeptics might have been more right than wrong. I just wonder too that when we're thinking about the kind of demise in many ways of the supranational organization, that the kind of increasingly weakness of the United Nations, of the WTO, I wonder if regional trade liberalization, even within the kind of the idea that this is a protectionist bloc for those who aren't members, is going to be the way of things going forward, at least for the time being. That the NAFTAs or whatever replaces NAFTA, and then whatever is going to replace perhaps Britain's being involved in that. Now Britain's joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or it's WTO. So they're trying to join a new regionalized trade liberalization initiative that I'm sure is seen as protectionist from those who aren't members. Right. So that's a kind of a half-hearted answer to your question.
So basically, let's not make the okay the enemy of the good.
There you go.
Sure.
There you go.
The line. Well, with that, I think we'll draw this to an end. It just leaves me to thank a list of people. First of all, thank you to all of you who are members of the book club, or IEA Insider Paid subscribers. If you would like to join either of these two groups, do please talk to Delino, who's the fellow in the pink tie at the back. Thank you to the IEA donors who supplied the wine, which will be available again after this, so do hang around for that. And finally, thank you to Marc for such an interesting discussion, and I think we can all give him a round of applause.